The rain fell soft and steady on the city streets, turning the pavement dark and shiny under the streetlights. A woman walked alone, her coat pulled tight against the damp air. She moved with purpose, not hurry, her shoes making quiet sounds on the wet sidewalk. She had left her car blocks away, wanting to feel the city breathe before tomorrow. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow she would sit on the bench high above the courtroom floor wearing black robes. People would stand when she entered. Voices would grow quiet. She would listen to arguments, weigh evidence, decide fates. But tonight she was just a person walking home after a long day at work. She turned onto a narrower street where the buildings leaned close together. Fire escapes crisscrossed overhead like iron lace. A few people hurried past under umbrellas, most not looking up, not seeing each other, just moving through the rain towards somewhere dry and warm. Then she heard it, raised voices, sharp and tight. Around the corner she slowed her steps, not out of curiosity but caution. She had learned long ago that tension in the air often meant someone was about to have a very bad night. Two police officers stood with a young man near a parked car. One officer had his hand on the man's arm, the other stood with feet apart, hands resting near his belt. The young man looked tired, more than angry, his shoulders slumped, his voice low but firm. "I told you I live right there," he said, nodding toward a building doorway. "I was taking out the trash." The officer holding his arm tightened his grip just slightly, not enough to leave marks but enough to communicate control. "You match the description," the officer said. "We got a call about someone messing with cars in this block." "I ain't messing with nothing," the young man said, his voice rising just a little. "I work overnight at the diner. I was taking trash to the bin like I do every Thursday." The woman watched from the shadows of an awning. She saw the officer's body language, the way they positioned themselves to block escape routes. She saw the young man's hands stay visible at his sides, palms out, a gesture learned through hard experience. She saw the rain dripping from the brims of hats onto tense shoulders. She could walk away. This was not her business, not tonight, not here. She had no badge, no authority in this moment, just a woman's body in the rain wearing ordinary clothes who would listen to her anyway. But then the second officer stepped closer, his voice dropping to a tone meant to intimidate. "You think we don't know your type," he said, "hanging around these cars waiting for an opportunity." The woman's chest tightened. She had heard that phrase before, your type, a phrase that erased individuality, that painted people with broad fearful strokes. She had heard it in courtrooms too, whispered between lawyers, in hallways, spoken by witnesses who thought their bias was invisible. The young man took a slow breath, his eyes flicking toward the woman under the awning. For just a second, a silent question: should I run, should I fight, should I submit? She gave the smallest shake of her head, almost imperceptible, a gesture that meant wait, breathe, stay calm. She stepped forward into the circle of light from a street lamp, the rain catching in her hair. "Officers," she said, her voice calm, not challenging, just present. Both officers turned toward her, their postures shifting slightly, the grip on the young man's arm loosening a fraction, not from respect but from uncertainty, a new variable in their equation. "Ma'am, this is police business," one said, his tone polite but firm, the kind used to move civilians along without escalation. "I understand that," she said, stopping a few feet away. "I live in this neighborhood too. I saw what happened from my window. That young man lives in the building right there, third floor, corner apartment. His grandmother answers the door. She wears a purple sweater and keeps geraniums on the fire escape." She did not actually live nearby. She had no idea about geraniums or grandmothers, but she had learned long ago that specific details carried weight, even invented ones, when delivered with certainty. The officer holding the man's arm glanced toward the building doorway, then back at her, suspicion warring with the possibility she might be telling the truth. "Ma'am, we received a report," she began again, her voice softer now, almost conversational. "Reports are important, they keep us safe, but so is getting the right person. Would it help if I walked up with him, knocked on the door, introduced myself to his grandmother?" The officers exchanged a look, the kind that passed judgment without words. One nodded slightly, the other released the young man's arm with a final squeeze that said, "This isn't over." "Go on," the first officer said, "but stay where we can see you." The woman walked toward the building, the young man falling into step beside her. They did not speak until they reached the shelter of the doorway, out of the rain and out of earshot. "Thank you," he whispered, his breath visible in the cool air. "I was just taking out trash, I swear." "I know," she said, "and I believe you, but that doesn't always matter, does it?" He shook his head. "No ma'am, it don't. They stood there for a moment, two strangers bound by a moment of tension, the rain falling harder now, drumming on the metal awning above them. "You should go inside," she said, "your grandmother might be worried." He almost smiled, almost but not quite. "She ain't my grandmother, ma'am, I live alone." She nodded, understanding the fiction they had both played, along with a necessary story to defuse a situation that should never have escalated in the first place. "Go on," she said again, "I will speak with the officers." He hesitated, then slipped inside the building, disappearing up the stairs. She turned back toward the street where the two officers still stood waiting. She walked toward them slowly, her hands visible, her posture open. "No threat here, just a neighbor concerned about her street." "You handled that well," one officer said, his tone less rigid now. "Did I?" she asked, "or did I just help you avoid making a mistake tonight?" The officers stiffened slightly, but she continued before they could respond. "I am not criticizing you," she said. "Truly, I understand your job is difficult. You respond to calls, you try to keep people safe, but sometimes the descriptions we receive, the assumptions we carry, they lead us to see threats where none exist." One officer opened his mouth to speak, but she raised a hand gently, not to silence but to ask for a moment more. "I have spent my life studying human behavior," she said, "not as a police officer but in other ways. I have learned that fear makes us small, it makes us see the world in simple terms, guilty or innocent, threat or safe, but people are never that simple." The rain began to ease, softening to a mist, the street lights casting halos in the damp air. "What do you do, ma'am?" the second officer asked, his curiosity genuine now, not defensive. "Tomorrow," she said, "I will sit in a courtroom and listen to stories all day long, some true, some false, most somewhere in between. My job is to find the truth beneath the words, to see the person beneath the situation, just as I tried to do tonight with you and that young man." She did not say she was a judge. She did not need to. Her words carried their own authority, quiet and earned, not demanded. The officers nodded almost in unison, a silent acknowledgement that something had shifted between them, not friendship, not agreement, but a moment of shared humanity. "We will check the building, ma'am," one said properly this time. "Knock on doors, ask questions the right way." She smiled just slightly. "Thank you." She turned to leave, then paused, looking back at them. "One more thing," she said softly. "The young man works at Miguel's Diner on 5th Street, overnight shift, hash browns perfectly crisp every time. You should try them sometime when you are off duty, not as officers but as people who deserve a good meal after a long night." Then she walked away, her footsteps quiet on the wet pavement, leaving the officers standing together under the street light, two men thinking about the weight of their badges, the assumptions they carried, the faces of everyone they had ever stopped. She did not look back, she did not need to. She had planted a seed, not of shame but of reflection, and sometimes that was enough. Sometimes one moment of humanity could change the course of many nights to come. The rain stopped completely, the clouds parting to reveal a sliver of moon above the rooftops. She walked toward home, her coat damp, her heart heavy but not broken. This was the work that never ended, the work of building understanding, one encounter at a time, one rainy night at a time, one life at a time. And tomorrow she would put on her robes and climb the courthouse steps and do the same work in a different room with different rules, but the same purpose: to see people, not types, to seek truth, not convenience, to remember that justice lived not in books alone but in the spaces between people, where kindness sometimes wore a uniform and sometimes wore a raincoat and always required courage to show up. The morning sun filtered through tall windows, casting long rectangles of light across the polished courtroom floor. Dust motes drifted slowly through the beams like tiny stars adrift in space. The judge sat in her chambers, sipping tea from a ceramic mug, the same mug she used every morning, its handle worn smooth by years of use. She reviewed case files spread across her desk, her fingers tracing lines of text, not rushing, not skimming, but absorbing each word, each fact, each human story behind the legal language. Outside her window the city woke, buses rumbled down wet streets, vendors set up carts on corners, people hurried to work, their breath misting in the cool air. She thought about the young man from last night, wondered if he had made it to his overnight shift, wondered if the officers had knocked on doors properly, wondered if any of them had slept well after that encounter. A soft knock came at her door. "Enter," she said, setting down her mug. The bailiff stepped inside, a tall man with kind eyes and a posture that spoke of decades of service. Your Honor, we are ready for the first case whenever you are. She nodded. Thank you, give me 2 minutes. He withdrew, closing the door gently behind him. She took a slow breath, straightened her robe, stood and looked at herself in the small mirror beside the bookshelf, not checking her appearance but reminding herself of the weight she carried today. Like every day she would listen, she would weigh, she would decide, and her decisions would ripple outward, touching lives she might never see again. The courtroom doors opened. She walked through them, head high, shoulders relaxed, not stiff the way some judges carried themselves. She took her seat. The bailiff announced her presence. Everyone rose. She nodded slightly. Take your seats, please. The first case was routine, a traffic violation. The defendant, nervous, hands fidgeting, spoke too quickly. The officer, calm, methodical, read from his report. She asked questions not to trap but to understand what led to the speeding, what circumstances, what pressures. She listened to both sides, then made her ruling fair but firm. The defendant left looking chastened but not broken. The officer left with a slight nod of respect. This was the work, ordinary, unglamorous but necessary. Case after case moved through the morning. A landlord-tenant dispute, a small claims matter, a plea agreement negotiated in the hallway. Each person who stood before her carried invisible weight, worries about money, family, health, dignity. She saw these things not in their files but in the way they held themselves, in the tremor of a voice, in the glance toward a waiting loved one. Then the bailiff approached her bench. Your Honor, next case is a motion to suppress evidence. Officers Miller and Vasquez are the responding officers. Her pen stilled. Miller and Vasquez. She had not caught their names the night before in the rain, but something in the bailiff's tone made her look up. Bring them in, she said. 2 officers entered the courtroom, walking with the measured pace of those accustomed to command. They wore crisp uniforms, badges gleaming. They approached the bench, stood at respectful attention, but something in their posture was different from the officers she usually saw in courtrooms, less rigid, more aware. They glanced around the room, taking in the wood paneling, the flags, the faces of those waiting their turn. She looked at the case file. Domestic disturbance call escalated to arrest. The defense attorney argued his client was detained without probable cause, questioned aggressively without being read rights. The prosecution countered that the situation was volatile. Officers acted appropriately to ensure safety. Officer Miller, she said, looking up from the file, you were first on scene, correct? Yes, Your Honor, he said, his voice steady but quieter than she expected. Describe what you saw when you arrived. He hesitated just a moment, then spoke. We received a call about shouting, a possible physical altercation at an apartment building, 3rd floor. We approached with caution, found the defendant in the hallway outside his apartment. He appeared agitated, was pacing back and forth. What did you do next? We identified ourselves, asked him to step away from the door for safety, asked if anyone inside was hurt. And his response? He became defensive, said we had no right to be there, refused to answer questions, said he wanted a lawyer. At what point did you place him under arrest? After he pushed past Officer Vasquez, attempted to re-enter the apartment. We believed someone might be in danger. We detained him to secure the scene. She turned to Officer Vasquez. Your perspective? Vasquez shifted his weight slightly. Your Honor, I observed the defendant did seem upset but not violent. He kept saying his sister was having a panic attack inside, that he was trying to get her medication, that he wasn't refusing to cooperate, just wanted to help his sister first. A silence settled in the courtroom, thick and meaningful. Miller glanced at Vasquez, surprise flickering across his face. Vasquez did not look back, kept his eyes forward, but his jaw tightened slightly. Interesting, she said softly. So there were 2 realities in that hallway. One officer saw a threat, another saw a brother trying to help his sister. She set down the file, folded her hands before her. Officers, I have a question, not about this case but about your work generally. When you respond to a call, what is your primary objective? Miller answered immediately, to protect public safety, Your Honor. And how do you determine what threatens public safety? He paused longer this time. By the situation, the behavior of individuals, the information we receive. She nodded, then looked at Vasquez. Officer, what do you think? Vasquez took a breath that seemed to carry weight from somewhere deeper than the courtroom. Your Honor, I think sometimes we see what we expect to see: a dark hallway, a raised voice, a person who doesn't immediately comply, and we fill in the rest with assumptions. I've been thinking about that lately. Miller turned fully toward his partner, now confusion clear on his face. She watched them both, the dynamic shifting in real time, not scripted, not planned, but human. Two people who work together every day suddenly seeing each other differently. Yesterday evening, she began, her voice calm but carrying through the quiet room. Did either of you respond to a call in the Riverside neighborhood around 9 p.m.? Both officers went still. Miller paled slightly. Vasquez straightened his spine. We did, Your Honor, Miller said. Tell me what happened. Miller glanced at Vasquez, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. Go ahead. Miller described the call, the description they'd received, the young man they'd stopped. He spoke factually but without defensiveness. When he reached the part where a woman had intervened, he paused. A civilian approached us, Your Honor, calmed the situation, suggested we verify the young man's residence properly. And did you? We did, Your Honor, Vasquez said, stepping in. We knocked on doors, spoke with residents, confirmed he lived there. We apologized for the misunderstanding. She looked between them, seeing not guilt, not shame, but something more valuable: reflection. Officer Vasquez, you said you've been thinking about assumptions lately. Was last night part of that? Yes, Your Honor, he said without hesitation. That woman last night, she didn't raise her voice, didn't demand anything, just asked us to see the person, not the suspicion, and it changed everything in that moment. Miller shifted uncomfortably but did not contradict him. She turned back to the case file before her, the domestic disturbance, the conflicting officer accounts, the brother worried about his sister having a panic attack. Officers, she said gently, I am going to grant the motion to suppress the statements made before Miranda rights were read, not because you acted with malice, but because in the rush to control a situation you missed a human being in distress, a man trying to help his sister, not a suspect to be contained. Miller started to speak but stopped himself. She continued, this ruling is not punishment, it is an invitation to carry last night's lesson into every call you answer. See the full picture before you act, because the difference between safety and harm often lives in that space between assumption and understanding. She signed the order, handed it to the bailiff, then looked at both officers one more time. Thank you for your honesty today, she said. That takes courage, more courage than many people possess. They left the courtroom together, walking slower than when they entered, shoulders less rigid, head slightly bowed, not in shame but in thought. The defense attorney approached the bench. Your Honor, that was unexpected, thank you. She nodded but said nothing. Some lessons were not for public consumption, some growth happened quietly in the space between words. The rest of the morning's cases passed in a blur, but her mind kept returning to the two officers, to the young man in the rain, to the woman who had stepped forward not as a judge but as a human being who saw another human being in a moment of need. Justice was not only what happened in courtrooms, she thought it was also what happened on rainy streets at 9 p.m. when someone chose to intervene with kindness instead of walking away. It was what happened when officers chose to knock on doors properly instead of making assumptions. It was what happened when partners chose honesty over saving face. The gavel came down on the last morning case. Court would reconvene after lunch. She rose, walked back to her chambers but did not sit at her desk. Instead she stood by the window, watching the street below, watching people move through their lives, unaware of the small moments that shaped them, unaware that a single act of decency could echo through a courtroom hours later, changing outcomes, changing hearts, changing what justice looked like in practice. She thought about the officers. Would they remember this day a year from now? Would they? The afternoon sun slanted through the courthouse windows, painting warm gold stripes across the wooden benches. The judge sat in her chambers eating a simple lunch: bread, cheese, and apple she had brought from home. Her door was open slightly, the sounds of the courthouse drifting in, footsteps, voices, the distant hum of the city outside. She thought about the officers, Miller and Vasquez, their faces in the courtroom, the shift in Vasquez's posture when he spoke about assumptions, the way Miller had listened even when uncomfortable. This was how change happened, not in grand declarations but in quiet moments of recognition between people who shared a purpose even when they saw the world differently. A knock came at her door, soft, tentative. Enter, she said. A young woman stood there, early 20s, nervous fingers twisting the strap of her bag. She wore a uniform, a diner apron folded neatly under her arm. Your Honor, the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper, I'm sorry to bother you during lunch, but I was told you might see me. Come in, sit please. The judge gestured to the chair across her desk. The young woman sat perching on the edge, not settling in. The judge set aside her lunch, gave her full attention. I'm Jay's friend, the young woman said. Jay, the one you helped last night on Riverside Street. The judge felt something warm in her chest. She had wondered about him all morning. Is he all right, she asked. Yes ma'am, he made it to work though he was late. His manager wasn't happy, but Jay told him what happened and the manager said he would have done the same thing, stood up for someone being treated wrong. The young woman took a breath, her hands still restless. Jay couldn't come himself, he works the overnight shift, starts in a few hours, but he wanted me to find you, tell you thank you properly, not just the quick thanks in the rain last night. He said you saw him when nobody else was even looking, you saw him as a person. The judge nodded, her throat tight, she had not expected this. Please tell Jay I am glad he is safe, she said. Truly that is all that mattered last night. The young woman leaned forward slightly, her nervousness giving way to something more determined. Your Honor, Jay told me everything, what the officers said, how they held him, how you stepped in, not like a hero, like a neighbor. He said you didn't make it about power, you made it about truth, and that made all the difference. The judge looked down at her hands, weathered by years of holding gavels, signing orders, writing notes, hands that carried authority but also fatigue. Sometimes, she said softly, the most powerful thing we can do is refuse to let a situation become about power at all. The young woman nodded as if this made perfect sense to her. Jay also said something else, she continued. He said one of the officers, the younger one, looked ashamed, not defensive, ashamed, like he realized in that moment he had been about to do something he would regret later, and your words gave him a way to step back without losing face. This interested the judge deeply. Tell me more about that. Well, Jay said, the older officer, the one doing most of the talking, he was set in his way, but the younger one kept glancing between Jay and the building doorway like he was doing the math in his head, realizing the description they got didn't really match Jay at all, but he didn't know how to say that to his partner until you showed up and gave him an opening. The judge remembered Vasquez in the courtroom, his words about assumptions, his willingness to speak a different truth than his partner. She wondered if last night had been the beginning of that courage, not the courtroom moment. Thank you for coming, she said to the young woman. This means more than you know. The young woman stood to leave, then paused at the door. Your Honor, Jay also wanted me to tell you something else. He said people like you, the ones who see clearly in messy moments, you matter more than judges in robes sometimes, because you show up when it counts, not when it's scheduled. Then she left, closing the door softly behind her. The judge sat alone for a long moment, the words settling deep inside her, not as praise but as responsibility. People were watching not just her rulings but her humanity, the space between her actions and her authority. That space mattered. She returned to the courtroom for the afternoon session, the air warmer now, sunlight bright on the benches. The first case involved a shopkeeper and a teenager accused of stealing a sandwich. The shopkeeper, angry, arms crossed, the teenager, small shoulders hunched, staring at the floor. The judge listened as the shopkeeper described the theft, the broken trust, the need for consequences. She listened as the public defender explained the teenager's circumstances, mother in hospital, bills piling up, hunger a real thing, not an excuse. Then she did something unusual. She asked everyone except the teenager to step outside the courtroom for 5 minutes, just 5 minutes. She wanted to speak with him alone, no lawyers, no shopkeeper, no audience, just two people in a quiet room. The teenager looked terrified when the door closed, but the judge did not sit on the bench. She came down to the counsel table, sat across from him at eye level. Tell me about your mother, she said. And he did, haltingly at first, then in a rush, the illness, the missed work, the empty cupboards, the shame of asking for help, the decision to take one sandwich, just one, when his stomach had been growling through third period math class. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she nodded. What would you do differently now, she asked, not to trap him but to understand. I would ask the shopkeeper, she said quietly. My mom taught me to ask, but I was embarrassed. I thought he would say no and then everyone would know we were struggling. The judge thought about the officers in the rain, about Jay, about assumptions, about dignity. Here is what will happen, she said, when the others return I will order you to work at the shop for 10 hours, sweeping, mopping, stocking shelves. You will earn enough to pay for the sandwich and a little extra for your mother. The shopkeeper will see your effort, you will see his business. Neither of you will be humiliated. This is not punishment, it is repair. The teenager's eyes filled, but he nodded. Yes, ma'am. When everyone returned, she announced her decision. The shopkeeper surprised but thoughtful, the lawyers taking notes, the teenager standing straighter, shoulders less hunched. As he left the courtroom he paused, looked back at her and gave a small nod, not of submission but of understanding. Case after case moved through the afternoon, each one a small world of hurt or hope or both. The judge listened, asked questions, looked at hands, faces, postures, the spaces between words where truth often hid. Near the end of the day the bailiff approached. Your Honor, Officer Vasquez is here. He says it's not about a case, he just wanted to speak with you briefly if you have time. She almost said no, her calendar was full, her energy thin, but something in the bailiff's tone made her pause. Send him in. Vasquez entered alone, no uniform now, just jeans, a sweater damp at the shoulders from the light rain that had begun to fall again. He looked younger out of uniform, less certain, more human. Your Honor, he began, then stopped, shook his head. I'm sorry, I don't know how to start this. Sit down, she said, gesturing to the same chair the young woman had occupied hours earlier. He sat, hands on his knees, fingers laced tight. After court this morning, Miller and we had a long talk. He said it wasn't easy. We've been partners 3 years, never had a real disagreement until last night, until this morning. She waited, letting the silence hold space for his words. I told him something I should have said sooner, Vasquez continued, when we got the call last night about a suspicious person. The description was vague, tall male, dark clothing, but Miller heard tall male and his mind went to a certain kind of person, a certain kind of threat. I saw the same description and I saw a person who might be taking out trash or walking home from work, but I didn't speak up, not at first. I went along with his lead because that's what partners do, we back each other up. His voice caught slightly. But backing someone up doesn't mean staying silent when they're heading the wrong way, does it? No, she said gently, it does not. This morning in court when I spoke about assumptions, I wasn't just talking about last night, I was talking about every night for 3 years. Moments I should have questioned, moments I let slide because it was easier than tension between partners. She saw the weight he carried, not guilt exactly but responsibility, the heavy beautiful burden of growth. What changed, Vasquez, she asked. You did, he said simply. Not because you were a judge, I didn't know that last night. You were just a person who saw clearly and spoke calmly, and in that moment clarity mattered more than authority. That stayed with me all night. I couldn't sleep thinking about how many times I've chosen ease over truth, how many J's I've let be treated as threats instead of people. He looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Your Honor, I'm not even sure I deserve it. I'm just telling you the truth because you modeled that last night and this morning, and I think truth is where change starts. She felt humbled, not proud. This was not about her, this was about a man choosing to grow when he could have stayed comfortable. Officer Vasquez, she said, when you go on duty tonight you will face new calls, new situations. What will you do differently? I'll pause, she said. I'll ask one more question. I'll look one moment longer. I'll speak up when my gut says something is off, even if it creates tension with my partner, because tension today beats regret tomorrow. She nodded. This was wisdom earned, not given. Thank you for coming, she said. Truly thank you for your honesty. He stood to leave, then turned back at the door. Your Honor, the young man Jay, his name is Jay Miller, and we found him this afternoon before our shift started. The city slept beneath a blanket of soft rain, the kind that fell without urgency, soaking into pavement and park benches, washing the dust from leaves. The judge sat by her window, a cup of tea cooling beside her. She had not turned on the television, had not checked emails, had simply watched the water trace paths down the glass, each drop finding its own way downward, like choices made in quiet moments. Her thoughts kept returning to Vasquez, to his words about choosing discomfort over ease. This was the heart of justice, not the gavel, not the robe, not the title, but the daily decision to see clearly when it would be easier to look away, to speak truth when silence would be safer, to stand with someone when walking past would cost nothing. A knock at her door surprised her. Visitors did not come to her home, especially not after hours. She rose, walked the short hall, opened the door. Miller stood there alone, no uniform, rain dampening his hair, his shoulders slumped, not in defeat but in something heavier, the weight of reconsideration. He held a paper bag in one hand. "Your Honor," he said, his voice rougher than in court, less polished, more real. "I know this is not protocol, I should not be here, but I needed to speak with you, away from the courthouse, away from Vasquez, away from everything." "Come in," she said, stepping aside. He entered, hesitated in her small living room as if unsure where to stand. She gestured to a chair. He sat, perching on the edge, just as the young woman had done hours earlier. Humans carried the same postures when nervous, vulnerable, uncertain. "I brought you something," he said, offering the paper bag. Inside, a container of food, still warm, hash browns, perfectly crisp. She recognized the description from her own suggestion days earlier from Miguel's diner. "Thank you," she said, setting it on the table between them, "but you did not need to bring food. You came here for a reason." He nodded, swallowed hard. "Your Honor, last night after Vasquez and I spoke, after we found Jay at the diner, something happened that I have not told anyone, not my wife, not my partner. I drove home, took off my uniform, hung it in the closet, and I could not look at it. I stood there staring at the badge, the patches, the name tag, and I felt like a stranger wearing someone else's skin." She listened without interrupting, letting the silence hold his words. "For 15 years I have worn that uniform," she said. 15 years of believing I was protecting people, of keeping the peace, but last night I realized I have been protecting a version of peace that only works for some people, the people who look like me, who move through the world without being questioned, who can take out trash at 9 p.m. without becoming a suspect. His hands trembled slightly on his knees. "Jay made us breakfast this afternoon. He and Vasquez, they talked while I mostly listened. Jay told us about growing up here, about learning early that his body in public space was seen as a question, not a statement, that he had to carry his student ID, his library card, even his grocery receipt sometimes, just to prove he belonged somewhere, that he had practiced keeping his hands visible since he was 12 years old." The judge felt the weight of these words, not as abstract concepts but as lived reality, the kind of reality that never appeared in police reports or court transcripts. 15 years, Your Honor," Miller continued, "and I never knew, not really. I saw compliance, I saw resistance, I saw guilt and innocence in the simple terms my training gave me, but I never saw the exhaustion, the constant calculation, the fear that lives beneath the surface for people like Jay, until Vasquez said something this afternoon. He said, 'We are not paid to be suspicious, we are paid to be curious,' and that changed everything for me." She understood then what was happening before her, not a confession, not an apology, but an awakening, slow, painful, necessary, like a limb waking after being asleep too long. "What will you do differently, Miller?" she asked. "I don't know yet," he admitted honestly, "but I know I will start by listening more than I speak, by asking why before I assume who, by remembering that every person I encounter has a life, a story, a dignity that exists whether I recognize it or not." This was enough, this was everything. The work of justice was not about perfection, it was about willingness to grow, to stumble, to rise differently. "Stay for tea," she said. He looked surprised, then nodded. "Yes ma'am, thank you." She poured 2 cups. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the rain a gentle rhythm against the window. "Your Honor," he began again after a while, "I have been thinking about the case this morning, the domestic disturbance, the brother trying to help his sister." "Yes. I was wrong," she said, not maliciously but carelessly. "I saw agitation and I called it aggression, I saw urgency and I called it threat. I did not ask enough questions, I did not look past my own certainty, and because of that a man spent hours in custody who should have been comforting his sister." She nodded. This was the heart of accountability, not defensiveness, not justification, but clear-eyed recognition of harm done even unintentionally. I have requested a meeting with my sergeant tomorrow. Miller said. I want to suggest new training for our precinct, not the usual defensive tactics but something about de-escalation, about recognizing mental health crises, about understanding that not every tense situation is a dangerous one. Sometimes tension is just humanity being human. She felt hope then, not the bright shiny kind but the quiet sturdy kind that grows from soil turned over by honest hands. That is a good start, she said. Not a start, he corrected, a continuation. Vasquez has been trying to tell me things for months. I just wasn't ready to hear him until last night, until you. Do not give me credit, she said gently. I was just a person in the rain. You and Vasquez and Jay, you did the real work. You chose to see each other fully. That is where change lives. He stayed another 20 minutes. They spoke of small things: his daughter starting college, his love of gardening, the way tomatoes grew best with consistent watering, not flooding. Justice, she thought, was like that too, not dramatic interventions but consistent daily choices to see people clearly, to treat them with dignity, to water the seeds of trust rather than drown them in suspicion. When he left, he walked down her front steps, shoulders straighter, not because he had been absolved but because he had been heard, and in being heard had found his own voice again. She ate the hash browns alone at her small table. They were perfect, crisp outside, soft inside, exactly as promised. She thought about the chain of moments that had led here: a rainy night, an intervention, a courtroom conversation, a diner breakfast, a visit after hours, each moment building on the last, not in a straight line but in a spiral, circling closer to understanding. Later that evening her phone rang. The caller ID showed the courthouse number, unusual for this hour. Your Honor, a voice said when she answered. It's the clerk from courtroom 3. I am sorry to bother you at home, but Officer Vasquez just dropped off a file. He said you should see it before tomorrow. What is it? It's not a case file, ma'am, it's something else. He called it a proposal. She went to the courthouse, the building quiet at this hour, lights dim in the hallways. She found the file on her desk, a simple manila folder, inside not legal documents but handwritten notes, observations from Vasquez and Miller about interactions they had witnessed or participated in over the past week, moments where assumptions had nearly led to escalation, moments where curiosity had diffused tension: a young woman crying in a parking lot, not a suspect but grieving a lost pet; an elderly man wandering, not confused but searching for a bus stop he could no longer find; a teenager running, not fleeing but late for work. They had documented each moment with care, not judgment but reflection. Beside each account they wrote what they did differently, what they would do next time, how they saw the human being beneath the situation. At the back of the file, a single sheet of paper held a proposal, a pilot program for their precinct, monthly sessions where officers could share difficult calls, not to assign blame but to learn together, to practice seeing the person, not the profile, to build what Vasquez called muscles of empathy. She read the entire file twice, her eyes stinging, not from sadness but from the beauty of people choosing to grow when they could have stayed comfortable. This was the work that never made headlines, no viral videos, no dramatic confrontations, just quiet daily choices to be better, to see clearer, to act with more humanity. She thought about Jay working his overnight shift right now, flipping burgers, pouring coffee, serving the city while it slept. She thought about Miller at home, perhaps finally able to look at his uniform without flinching. She thought about Vasquez drafting this proposal after his shift ended, tired but committed. Justice was not a destination, she realized it was a practice, a daily returning to the question: how can I see this person more fully? How can I respond with wisdom, not fear? How can I repair rather than punish? The rain had stopped, clouds parting to reveal stars scattered across the night sky. She locked the courthouse door, walked home through streets glistening under streetlights, each puddle holding a piece of sky, a reminder that even broken surfaces could reflect beauty if given the chance. Tomorrow she would approve the proposal. She would connect Vasquez and Miller with the police chief. She would use her position not to command but to create space for this work to grow. But tonight she would simply walk home, breathe the clean rain-washed air, feel gratitude for the messy, beautiful work of being human together. Because the light that guided ships home was not the lighthouse itself but the choice to keep the lamp burning night after night regardless of weather. Riga. Morning arrived gentle and clear, the kind of dawn that feels like a promise. The judge walked to the courthouse earlier than usual, wanting to see the city wake without the rush of midday crowds. She passed the diner on 5th Street, its windows steamed from the breakfast rush. She did not go inside but paused at the window, watching Jay move behind the counter, calm, efficient, his hands steady as he flipped pancakes, poured coffee, greeted regulars by name. He looked tired but not broken. He looked like a person who had slept, knowing he was seen as human, not a threat. She continued her walk, her mind turning over the proposal from Vasquez and Miller, the handwritten notes, the careful observations, the hope woven through every page. This was how change happened, not in sweeping declarations but in small daily choices: to see people fully, to ask one more question, to pause before acting. The courthouse steps felt different beneath her feet today, not heavier, not lighter, but more purposeful, each step a reminder that justice was not a destination but a practice, a returning again and again to the question, how can I be more human today than I was yesterday? In her chambers she placed the proposal on her desk, not in a file, not in a drawer, but where she would see it first thing each morning, a touchstone, a reminder that systems changed when people within them chose growth over comfort. The first case of the day brought an unexpected visitor as the bailiff announced the matter, a civil dispute over a damaged fence. The defendant entered the courtroom and the judge recognized him immediately, the older officer Miller, but not in uniform, in simple clothes, his posture different, less rigid, more open. He carried himself like a man who had done difficult work on himself overnight and was continuing that work in daylight. He did not look toward the bench immediately. Instead he glanced around the courtroom, taking in the wood, the flags, the faces of those waiting their turn. When his eyes finally met hers, there was no defensiveness, no expectation of praise, only quiet acknowledgement, a silent thank you for the space she had given him to grow. The case itself was simple: neighbors disagreeing over property lines, tempers flaring, words spoken that could not be taken back. The judge listened to both sides, then did something unusual. She asked them to describe not the fence, not the damage, but their homes, what they loved about their yards, where their children played, where they drank coffee in the morning. At first they resisted, sticking to legal arguments about surveys and boundaries, but slowly they began to speak of rose bushes carefully tended, of a bench where one man watched sunsets, of a treehouse where a little girl dreamed of adventures. The anger in the room softened, not disappeared, but softened like ice melting in morning sun. She ruled on the legal matter fairly, dividing responsibility for repairs, but then she added something not required by law. She suggested they share the cost of a new fence, one built together, not as adversaries but as neighbors who lived side by side in the same rain, the same sun, the same city. They left the courtroom still not friends but no longer enemies, a small shift but real, the kind that accumulates over time into something resembling peace. Through the morning more cases flowed, each one a small world of hurt or hope. The judge listened, asked questions, looked for the human story beneath the legal language. She remembered Vasquez's words, we are paid to be curious, not suspicious, and she carried that curiosity into every interaction. Just before lunch the bailiff approached. Your Honor, there is someone here to see you, not for a case, just a visitor. She nodded. Send them in. A woman entered her chambers, late 60s, gray hair pulled back neatly, wearing a simple dress and cardigan. She moved with the careful grace of someone who had spent a lifetime caring for others. Your Honor, the woman said, her voice soft but clear, I am Jay's grandmother. The judge felt a warmth spread through her chest. She gestured to the chair. Please sit. The woman sat, not perching on the edge but settling in as if she had earned the right to take up space in any room she entered. Jay told me what happened, the woman began, last week in the rain with the officers and you. He told me how you stepped forward not as someone important but as a neighbor. He said you saw him when others saw only suspicion. The judge nodded. I saw a young man taking out trash in the rain, nothing more, nothing less. The woman smiled, a smile that held decades of wisdom and weariness. Both. I have lived in the city 62 years, Your Honor. I have raised 3 children here, buried a husband here, watched my grandchildren learn to walk on these streets. I have seen officers come and go, seen policies change, seen promises made and broken, but I have rarely seen what you did that night. Not intervention, not heroism, but simple recognition, the recognition that my grandson is a person worthy of dignity regardless of the hour or the color of his skin. The judge felt tears press at her eyes, but she did not look away. This was not about her, this was about a grandmother speaking truth across a desk in a courthouse chamber. Your Honor, the woman continued, I did not come here to thank you, though I do thank you. I came here to tell you something important. Change does not happen because good people do dramatic things. Change happens because ordinary people make small choices again and again to see each other fully. My grandson chooses kindness even when he is treated poorly. The officers you met chose to listen even when it was uncomfortable. You chose to step forward in the rain when walking away would have been easier. These small choices, they pile up like stones until one day you realize you have built something solid, something that can shelter people. The woman stood to leave, then paused at the door. One more thing. Jay starts community college next semester, night classes. He wants to be a social worker. He says he wants to help people navigate systems that were not built for them. He says meeting you reminded him that one person seeing another person clearly can change a life. Then she left, closing the door softly behind her. The judge sat alone for a long moment, the words settling deep, not as praise but as responsibility. This was the work that mattered, not the rulings, not the robes, but the ripple effects of choosing humanity in small moments. After lunch she approved the proposal from Vasquez and Miller, not with fanfare, not with announcements, but with a simple note to the police chief: this deserves our support. Please make space for these officers to lead this work. The rest of the day passed in its usual rhythm: cases, arguments, rulings, but something had shifted in her, not dramatically but subtly, like a compass needle finding true north. She carried the stories of J. Miller, Vasquez, the grandmother, the teenager who stole a sandwich, not as separate incidents but as threads in the same fabric, the fabric of a community learning to see itself more clearly. As evening approached she walked home again through streets now dry and warm from the day's sun. Children played on stoops, laughter ringing clear and bright. An elderly man watered plants on his fire escape, nodding to her as she passed. She nodded back. Two strangers sharing a moment of recognition, nothing more, nothing less, but everything. She thought about the lighthouse keeper from stories she had read, how he climbed the stairs each night, not for praise, not for recognition, but because someone out there in the darkness might need the light to find their way home. Justice was like that too, not a spotlight but a steady beam, a promise that someone was watching, someone cared enough to show up night after night, regardless of thanks, regardless of whether anyone was watching. The work would never be finished. There would always be new tensions, new misunderstandings, new moments where fear overtook curiosity, but there would also always be new opportunities to choose differently, to pause, to ask, to see the person, not the profile. She reached her apartment building, climbed the stairs to her door, unlocked it, stepped inside. The space quiet, familiar, welcoming. She did not turn on lights right away. Instead she stood by the window watching the city glow beneath the emerging stars, each light a home, a life, a story. Tomorrow she would return to the courthouse, climb the steps where the robes sit on the bench, listen, wait, decide. But tonight she was just a person who had spent her day trying to see others fully, who had been seen in return, who had participated in the quiet, beautiful work of building something better, one small choice at a time. This was enough, this was everything. The stars outside her window did not shine because they expected gratitude, they shone because that was their nature, to give light in darkness. Justice was the same, not a performance, not a destination, but a nature, a way of being in the world, choosing again and again to see clearly, to act kindly, to believe in people even when they stumble, especially when they stumble, because growth lived in those stumbles. If we had the courage to rise differently than we fell. And somewhere in the city Jay flipped pancakes in a diner. Miller sat with his daughter helping with homework. Vasquez drafted notes for next week's training session, each of them carrying forward the small light kindled on a rainy street, the light that said, you are seen, you are human, you matter. The judge turned on a lamp, soft yellow light filling her room. She sat down, poured tea, let the warmth seep into her hands. This was the work, this was the life, this was enough. Always had been, always would be.